Welcome, Gareth. This is a small crowd, so you can do the. It's going to be an intimate talk. So Gareth is here for a short research visit that might, we hope, lead for a project next year. And what this project might be, you probably can learn from his presentation. So let's start.
Just thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you, Eyal, for having me over. And also just thank everyone else, Abigail and Mai and Nir and everyone else in the centre, just for looking after me this past week. It's been extremely interesting, and I'm quite I'm quite saturated by the experience. Just by way of kind of introduction, my name is Gareth Kennedy. I'm an artist from Ireland. I'm still based there, but increasingly I'm undertaking kind of projects across Europe. I might actually just start just by way of a kind of icebreaker, just with a video on a kind of contextualizing kind of video. So this is about a minute long, a minute 18. And this isn't my video, this is just something from the Digital Bazaar. Do we have sound?
Oh.
Where were you manufactured, Siri?
Wherever you are, that's where I am.
Where were you built?
Siri, was designed by Apple in California.
But where were you manufactured?
That's classified.
Where were you built?
Like it says on the box. I was designed by Apple in California.
But please tell me where you were made.
I don't know what you mean by, but please tell me where you were made.
How were the working conditions for people in the factories at Foxconn in China?
Mark, I can't search near businesses. My apologies.
So just by way of direct counterpoint to that, I'll just move on to my next slide. So my background is in sculpture, and the particular school of sculpture I would have gone to in Ireland had an emphasis on kind of social engagement, and how whatever kind of work we would make, how that would kind of interface, I suppose, with social realities. Probably for the last 5 years, I've had this kind of very specific kind of relationship with ideas around the handmade and ideas around the kind of social agency of things that are handmade, and with particular respect to craft work. This is a very famous, like, kind of Irish, everyone in Ireland knows what this slide is. It's a kind of slide of kind of this documentation made in the early 80s of all these traditional handcrafts in Ireland that were just going out of fashion, were just becoming obsolete kind of skill sets. A kind of movement from kind of a kind of trade or kind of gilded set of kind of skills, or very embodied kind of skills and knowledge, to kind of more the outsource of manufacturing and so on, and things being made in factories we don't know where. So kind of like a kind of counterpoint to this kind of social agency of the handmade being made on location by particular sets of people, what I call a community of interest that's brought together on a particular location to manufacture something. There's always this kind of backdrop of China, everything being made in China, or this notion, this kind of gap we're experiencing in contemporary life between production and consumption. You know, we really don't know where things come from, or indeed where they go. So like, these are just kind of general kind of things that kind of motivate my practice from I suppose a sculptural material kind of type of background. this idea of translations in material culture, material use and meaning, the economy and ecology of objects, where objects come from, where they go, what's the relationship with kind of realms beyond just the marketplace, the social life of objects, how objects are kind of protagonists in kind of generating certain kind of behaviors between people and so on. The biography of the object. This is actually a Russian constructivist term from the 1920s, which has got to do with this kind of search for the kind of socialist object that would be equitable in at every stage in its production, from harvesting material to the labour relations around the production of a teapot or a table or so on. So that's just kind of some theory, constructivist theory I'm quite interested in, quite utopic stuff to say the least. And then this idea finally of invented traditions, invented ritual, speculative customs. All traditions are in large part an invention. They come from somewhere. They're in a composite or an amalgamation of different ideas of the world, or different aesthetics or different kind of belief systems. So I'm going to go through 3 projects today. By all means, I don't know how communicable my Irish accent is, or I don't speak international English. I'm trying, but I still have a colloquial nuances, or not even nuances, hindrances. So by all means, just interject or ask questions as we go. So by way of I'm going to show a project that I've done in the recent past. I'm going to show another project I've done recently, and then I'm going to show a project that's I bring to you this evening in fragments. So first to kind of give body to some of those kind of ideas that I was talking about, some of this biography of the objects, social economy, China, workshop of the world, etc. This is a kind of infatuation I've had with Ikea for probably the last 3 or 4 years. Ikea is the world's largest manufacturer. It's got 22,000 at least global flows of materials and products. It's a kind of uncompromising kind of big blue box that arrives in different different countries. So here, what we have here is an Ikea World Map, illustrating Ikea everywhere from Saudi Arabia to North America to Japan to obviously Russia. In this map, Ireland isn't coloured in. Ikea came belatedly to Ireland in 2009. Until that time, everyone had to go on a pilgrimage to Belfast to get their I don't know what have you, black table, for instance. For example, one of 11,000 products. This is Ikea in Dublin. This is actually just the architect's drawing of it. But I suppose this is a kind of counterpoint to what I'm saying about, this idea of getting people to work with their hands, craftsmanship. These things are kind of like anachronisms in the 21st century. They're kind of like, why would you do that? It's got no economic viability beyond very select designers or artists or artisans that have very kind of particular oeuvres, let's say, and therefore very particular market values. But this kind of idea of Ikea as this kind of socially democratic, kind of influence, kind of Swedish work ethic and material ethic and marketing ethic that kind of permeates the culture. But I was just kind of interested in Ikea, since it arrived in 2009 in Ireland. Suddenly banal Ikea objects are kind of springing up everywhere in everyday life, everywhere within Ireland. Not saying they weren't there before, but it's more conspicuous now in its kind of banality. But and then this is kind of like an investigation into the kind of Ikea's kind of corporate culture and its origins, which come from a very rural part of Sweden called Småland. This is a catalogue from 2009, of course. This could be any field in the west of Ireland, but I'm quite interested in the way Ikea instrumentalizes the Swedish landscape to imbue it with ideas of thrift and hard work and kind of small farmers' kind of values and kind of resourcefulness, So coupled with this kind of runs all the way through into kind of a kind of corporate mission statement, which is in place in some parts quite evangelical to kind of organise people's lives and sell more product, or forever sell more product. So out of this kind of background research, this is a public art commission I made in a place called Guineguilla. It's a small village of 500 people in the southwest of Ireland. The village got new sewerage works or water works, and out of that a percentage of the money is given over to manifest a public artwork in the village. Guineguilla is a profoundly rural agricultural place, and as with everywhere in Ireland, we kind of have layers of history, and much of that is spoken, and much of it is oral, and much of it is laden with myth and speculation and embellishment, depending on who you're telling. You kind of always kind of perform. Irish people, we very much perform our history orally, but also this particular village and its area, surrounding area, this is like an example of its history. 14 journals produced between 1981 and the present. So it's just as this community of 500 people are producing these journals and all this local lore, all these different characters, all these events, who emigrated to America, what became of them, so on and so on and so on, you know. So like coming to this little village, I was obliged to read all this, which was at times interesting and at times more laboured. But for me to kind of get a sense of kind of place and be able to kind of recognise the kind of landmarks of the area and what people were talking about, this was kind of the first stage in an engagement with the place. So out of that, this is a map of Ireland, and this is the southwest of Ireland. These kind of peninsulas which stick out into the sea, into the Atlantic Ocean. The Gulf Stream comes up here. We're very fortunate for us, otherwise we'd be like as cold as Canada. And the Gulf Stream literally kind of like bathes this area in what we call a fierce, mild climate all year round, which is essentially the grass grows all year, and rare we get frost and we get snow, but never so severely. But what we have here is a kind of ideal landscape for pastoralism. The land isn't so good for arable, for growing crop, for growing wheat or grain, but for pasture, for dairy production, it's got a very deep history going back like 4,000, 5,000 years. So I was kind of interested in this kind of social economic history around butter production in particular. These are economic roads. You have around here all these hinterlands of people just producing butter. This was their kind of access to a kind of market economy. The butter would be hit these roads and be brought to the city in the southwest of Ireland called Cork. There would be packaged and graded and salted to make a kind of secure product, and from there it would be exported all across the British Empire. And for about 250 years, this region was the kind of centre of the British Empire's butter production. Cork butter was known around the British colonies as a very good, stable product from the 1600s onwards. So that's like a kind of proto-globalised kind of product. So I was just kind of interested in this kind of history's backdrop. This is the Cork Butter Exchange, which was featured on the London Stock Exchange on a daily basis right up until, I suppose, we got independence. All of that history, to kind of park that for a moment, and this is kind of Guineguilla today. Here we have an example of, this is like a motif of contemporary Ireland. We had this kind of housing boom through the 2000s, and then we had the crash. So kind of we've got all this kind of empty housing stock. Every town, village and city in Ireland is kind of bookended or full of unfinished housing that was made for a speculative property market, which, from 2007 with the subprime mortgage crisis, all markets being connected, spread to Ireland, the contagion, and suddenly the game was up. So Guineguilla, like what I proposed as a for the proposal for Guinea Gwilla was not some bronze or not something permanent, but was to invent a contemporary tradition for the village, a speculative custom or a ritual, and that we would do something and we would film this event, and we would call it a folk fiction. We wouldn't call it a documentary. We wouldn't call it. We'd create this kind of speculative moment, and we'd create a film out of that would create something that we could reflect upon. Guinea Gwilla, of course, is a lot of emigration, a lot of unemployment, also quite a bit of male suicide, which is absolutely devastating in a small population. It really ripples through. So the idea was to create this something that was an expression of continuity in spite of difficult economic times. It's kind of what I identified as the village kind of needing. So here we have 2 Ikea tables bought in Dublin and brought to this empty house, which for like 2 weeks became 1 part workshop, wood workshop, and the other part kind of film set. And this is kind of footage. This is I shoot the films on Super 8. I can kind of discuss that more later, but it's got to do with ideas around what I call critical anachronism, which I'll come back to. That's kind of things being out of place in an interesting sort of way, in a meaningful sort of way, and also the fact that it's silent. People don't feel like they have to perform themselves. It's a silent medium, and also the metabolism of like. It's not instantaneous like digital, so the fact that films have to be sent to Berlin and come back, it creates this nice pace to the project, which really works well, you know, with working with people on location. This is the carpenter Martin Nash in the corner. The film documents Martin like going to Dublin, buying this table, bringing it to this empty house. He builds the flat pack table, then he picks up his skill saw and he cuts the table straight down the middle. It falls into 2 pieces. And from that moment, there's this like vandalism or transgression of this this like perfectly good table. It's a very rather nice table, very fine table. But there's this act of vandalism, and from that moment on, kind of like Martin, who's a 3rd generation carpenter, but is unemployed since the crash. His kind of handwork or skill sets are set against this kind of act of transgression or vandalism to this perfectly good table, more than likely made from wood from the Russian Federation, birch wood. If you know birch, it's a very slender. We'll talk about birch later. More than likely made from birch from Northern Europe, and then assembled ultimately in China. That's its barcode. So then over the kind of this period of about 10 days, I think it took us, like Martin fashioned this. It's called a tabletop churn. The largest possible churn you could manufacture from the table. And then using a stainless steel shelving unit, we worked with another local kind of stainless steel welder to fabricate the metal fabrication. So all in the unit is about so big. And this is this kind of idea translation of objects and materials I go on about. And then we had this kind of public moment where basically everyone in the village was invited to come down in a procession, come down through the house, gather around this unit, which incidentally the only people who use serious or manufacture them today and use them seriously are the Amish in America, which is quite interesting, and use this kind of unit to kind of create this like about 40 pounds of butter, which was then packed into another kind of like a cask or a barrel, so-called firkin, which we fashioned from the other IKEA table. So this was like this kind of economic, social, cultural, economic kind of ritual of the churning, with everyone having a go, you know, and everyone kind of putting energy into it. And then of course, like, I mean, you have this magic moment where the buttermilk separates from the animal fat, and you have suddenly golden butter, which is kind of everyday, but kind of magic when people are investing so much kind of interest in it, you know, so much attention. And then we had a parade or a procession, this is one of those 17th century roads, pure straight roads, economic butter road, Instead of turning left to go to Cork, we turned right. We went through the only street in the village, and then we went to the local bog. I don't know if you certainly don't have bogs down here, but the bog. How do I explain this?
The swamp.
It's more special than a swamp. It's like it's if oil is like 90 million years old, and coal is like 40 million years old. Well, a bog is like 10,000 years old, and it's like basically compressed woody matter that is wet. You're right in that, but it's like a proto fossil fuel, and in Ireland we cut it and we dry it and then we burn it. But it preserves things quite interestingly. So you might hear bog bodies and whatnot, or I don't know. But it's a kind of Northern European.
We don't have enough food.
You're not, yeah, or enough wet. You need moisture.
It's
We use it for heating also.
Yeah, for heating and usually.
משהו שיכול להפוך להסקה.
It's a kind of typical Northern European landscape, but especially in Ireland, almost half Ireland is the bog, and it's a very emotional landscape for us because that's where we got energy from. And many happy childhoods cutting the bog and drinking red lemonade, and it's emotional for the population. It's the Scandinavians also have it, and so do the Belgians and the Dutch. And all through the Balkans.
We find it on Google Translate.
Okay.
Like in Hebrew.
The bog, right?
Yeah.
Torf in German, or torf in actually Slavic as well. Yeah. Torf in Russian. So we buried the cask of butter in the bog. Everyone gathered around. We buried it, covered it over, went home, forgot about it. I hope. And in doing that, it becomes, the bog has this very special. It's if you want to find an Irish mummy, you dig in the bog and you find preserved remains of people. You find preserved Viking boats or old prehistoric Stone Age boats. It has this special property of preserving things. So this is an example of previous bog butters, which literally date back like 4,500 years. These images are from the National Museum of Ireland. Of bog butters that are preserved in the landscape. The butter is no longer edible. The bog has an alchemy, which turns it into just an animal fat, which you probably, arguably is still digestible, but I don't know. But it's heritage. You can't. It's history and an antiquity indeed. So you can't go consuming it. So this becomes what I talk about, this critical anachronism, and the people in the village love this idea that this would become this kind of like time capsule, an IKEA time capsule, a totally anonymous vessel made out of IKEA birch wood, and we only just left the barcode that you saw earlier in the table, so that was the only identifying kind of unit, and so this is to be, as a public artwork, it's to be lost or forgotten, remembered or rediscovered over the next 10, 100,000 years. I don't know, or maybe never. I don't know. Who knows? So that's what I'm kind of interested in an Irish context, is memory and landscape and stuff like this. Which there's a lot of that we still have, and people still have it. Which is quite kind of Ireland. Kind of. We didn't really have an industrial revolution. We jumped straight from working on the bog to working in pharmaceutical companies and working in IT. It was a miracle. That's a generalization as well. But so then, as part of this, a kind of other projects I made, which I'm not presenting tonight using IKEA furnitures, went on a national tour. Not the contemporary art spaces, which wouldn't be white kind of cube spaces, wouldn't be so interesting to give people a Guinea Gwilla, but the National Museum of Ireland's Country Life. This was really legitimised the work they did, and very proud and pleased that the work went there for about 4 months. There's like a museum of the country people, you know, country crafts and so on. And then also the National Craft Gallery in a place called Kilkenny. So it's that kind of dialectic around craft and design, which got rather quite interesting. Ikea being designed and the churn being crafted, but there's a lot there, you know. The final kind of films, they were presented live to the audiences with live music sometimes, but ultimately kind of in the museum space they're kind of held in these kind of flat pack birch plywood back projection spaces where you just run kind of
Do you
silently.
have a small segment of the film?
I do. I don't have it here. No, I'm sorry. But we have it. We put it up online. No, we put the other film up online. We put this work up online.
Yeah.
I can put that up again. A 3-minute section of the churning. I'm sorry I didn't. Kind of on the kind of strength of that project somehow got mediated through the internet, and somebody was in the algorithm came across that project. Somebody in Russia, Anna Bikina, who works as part of Talk with Maria Weitz. Maria was down here last year. Maria Weitz was down here working with the centre here last year. So I was invited to become part of this temporary kind of public arts, manifestation in St. Petersburg in the Russian Federation, entitled Critical Mass. Not the St. Petersburg we might have in our mind, but the St. Petersburg of a place called Kupchina, which is to visit today. It's exemplary. It's a prime example of Khrushchev era 1960s Soviet Russia, the new kind of urban and domestic and civic solution for a growing Soviet population. Quite one size fits all, so like these kind of tower blocks with a lot of kind of quite hostile, and certainly in winter, green space in between. These are birch trees, by the way, obviously these were built very, very quickly in the 1960s to house the growing Soviet population. It's kind of one size prefabricated solution to fit all Soviet peoples. So you'll find architecture like this, whether it's in Murmansk in the very far north, above the Arctic Circle, Vladivostok in the far east, and also in the Caucasian republics. It's really a very, as well as Moscow and so on. So I was invited here to produce a work for this critical mass. This is just kind of initial kind of research. This is back to this biography of the object and this kind of revolutionary moment Russia had of the constructivists in the 1920s, and this idea of the socialist object. So initially my research was around, okay, I'll work with a tower block, and we'll create some sort of article together that will have a public moment and a public celebration, but then will become a kind of privatized domestic implement. This was what I was thinking. So like it's a rather good book, Imagine No Possessions, and this kind of search for a socialist object that doesn't have that isn't corrupted by capitalist kind of market values and labor injustices and so on and so on. So this is me in a cafe in Russia, and that's my little cafe, and then at the bottom of it, it's kind of like made in Russia, the glass, so on, got me thinking. So if this was an opportunity to go to kind of the source, like, and the idea I originally proposed was to kind of to get to the timber IKEA we're using. A lot of production takes place in Russia. To get to the timber IKEA we're using before it went to China, before it became flat packed. So I wanted to kind of somehow arrest that material before it went elsewhere, you know. I wanted to get it fresh out of the Russian forest. And legitimately, through working with these people called Svedmund, which is a subsidiary of IKEA. It's essentially IKEA, it's just their kind of timber processing plant. This is in a place called Tikvin, which is 250 kilometers southwest of St. Petersburg, on Swedish Avenue. So you have all this. We approached the site manager, Anna, Bikina and Maria approached the site manager. Initially things were going very good. The site manager was very interested. As he said, his workers, they never get to see the end product. They just get to see the trees arriving on trucks, cutting it to certain forms, certain formats, and then shipping it off elsewhere. They never get to see the finished product. This would be good, and they'll have a relationship with a community. So initially that was very promising until he went to head office in Sweden, in Almhult, in the Småland place I showed you earlier. And head office said, no, we don't need this Irish man coming over. We just don't need it. You know, business is business. We don't need this. So on and so on. Kind of tied in. I don't want to, speculate too widely, but IKEA kind of historically has escaped kind of anti-globalization backlash. Kind of. When I was going to college, people were throwing bricks through the windows of McDonald's and Starbucks and so on, anti-globalization. IKEA avoided all that because it was, Swedish and good furniture, or cheap furniture, Swedes are okay. But then in 2012, IKEA was one of their subcontractors, I should say, was caught cutting down 800-year-old Russian forest, primordial forest, and then making really shitty shelves ultimately as it goes through the, $10 kind of pine wood shelving unit out of 800-year-old timber. And the attendant ecosystem, of course, that's been growing for 800 years, wiped out. So IKEA got a lot of flack for that. So maybe they thought I was an activist type or something. But I'm kind of interested in that, the kind of banality of this shelf that you buy for $25 in IKEA, and then the wood actually comes from an 800-year-old tree. That for me is so banal, yet in equal parts so obscene. It's really quite interesting. But for me, anyway, all the work I've done with IKEA, it's not really. I'm not having to go to IKEA. IKEA is just raw material to me. It's just context, just backdrop. It's important to say that. Back to Kupchina. Sorry, excuse me. This is an American spy photo, probably from a U-2 or a Lockheed Blackbird. I don't know. I used to be into my spy planes. I like to think it was a U-2 from 1966. U-2 flying over Kupchina, Russia, just south of St. Petersburg, and what's going on. And you can see all the building of the new flats, the new Soviet era flats. You can see it all going on. So I got this image. If Guinea-Gwilla had its journal so high, Kupchina had a place that you would think, where's the history here, or where do you even begin to get a history before 1960? Kupchina has a brilliant man called Denis Shapilov, who's got he's a taxi driver, but he's also a local amateur historian. I don't know, he's got a fantastic website, kupsala.org. I spent long hours with this and Google Translate, and I don't know where he gets these images. I don't know how he got this from the US Ministry of Defense. I don't know, but that's the kind of man. He's a very Cartesian, very driven man, with a great sense of place. I'll continue. This is, anyway, Kupchina, hostile Soviet space, post-Soviet space, originally built, I suppose, the last 30 years, still with us 50 years plus later. So this kind of red circle, this is Dennis's graphic, and then we look in here closely, we can see this village of 38 wooden houses, and I'll come to the one particular house in particular, but this is the original Kupchina. This is the Kupchina that predates this location. People living here in wooden houses predates Peter the Great. Originally the Finns set up Kupsala, and then the Swedish Empire was part of the Swedish Empire. It's traditionally a kind of trading town, set up in the 1670s. Peter the Great arrives St. Petersburg from 1701 onwards and so on. 20th century St. Petersburg, Kupchina becomes a suburb of St. Petersburg. But this house in particular is the one I was drawn to. This is the so-called last wooden house of Kupchina. And that's a photo of it in 1972 I came across again on Dennis's website. And this is the last of those 38 houses. And we can see in the background the new Kupchina, the shock of the new Kupchina. This house was occupied by Alexandra Dmitrievich Vasilieva, and basically, long story short, she would not leave her house. She had no interest in living in a modern Soviet dwelling on the 5th floor or whatever, with running water and the latest in Soviet appliances and whatnot. She had no interest, she just would not leave her house. So the authorities took away her furniture, they took away her water, they took away her electricity, and essentially she wound up spending like 5 years squatting her own house. With support from the new Kupczynski. The story goes that the new people who moved into the Kupchina, they came from all over, and they supported her, you know. For 5 years in Brezhnev era Soviet Union, which is like that's quite a feat, I think, in any political or social context, but Brezhnev era Soviet Union more so perhaps, or I don't know. Until eventually the authorities came and they demolished her house, they knocked it down, they arrived with armed guards, they arrived with a lot of backup because they were kind of scared there was going to be a riot. Knocked the house, demolished it. Vasilieva still wouldn't go and live in one of the new houses, she moved to the countryside. The family gathered the remnants of the house and relocated to the countryside and built it for her out there. It became a dacha, this country home. So this kind of story for me was like just to move on, like her family gather every year for the last 37 years at the site of this house to commemorate the resistance, to commemorate their mother, their grandmother, or mother or grandmother or great grandmother, her spirit, her how would you say, yeah, her, I don't know, just her what's the name in Russian again? I've lost it. So this for me, when I came across this story, this is a very intimate, like, family story. But for me, it was also, oh my God, this is a massive story regarding a history of, like, obviously Kupchina, but also more broadly, kind of, you know, civic, social, private, public space in from Soviet Union through the transition, and it also, like, with particular regard to Kupchina, it's like last wooden house, it's like almost the belly button of Kupchina. It's the source, it's the origin of Kupchina, you know, the navel of Kupchina. So what I was really interested in was working with two schools in Kupchina and different parts of Kupchina, which is now huge, sprawling. There's about over 600,000 people. Maybe not 600,000, but there's probably certainly over 100,000. There's a lot of people there now. So I was interested in working with two different schools, with young people that were born, obviously, generally a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union, you know, millennium children, babies, and I was interested in how to transmit this myth, this story of Kupchina, and as a kind of origin myth of Kupchina, you know. So I worked with two schools. I worked with predominantly boys in this, like, woodworkers school. These are big, like, kind of 1960s era, like, woodworking machines, really serious machinery. So I worked with boys in this school, and with them with my producer, who was a very good man indeed, we went to the Russian forest and cut down birchwood trees, got permission. We brought the trees to this school, where the boys brought it in through the windows, and then they spent like about a week manufacturing this timber frame, which I'll show you in a moment, which was to half scale of the original house of Kupchina. Meanwhile, in another part of Kupchina, you had like this kind of more academic school for kids between like 7 and 17. Both of these demographics of kids, they've got different futures. These guys will certainly, they're probably in the army now, a lot of them, and or they'll go on to kind of technical kind of trades or hand trades. Whilst this kids that go to this school will probably wind up in university and so on, and higher education, more kind of academic. So in the other school, we kind of worked with the children who were a little bit younger, and some of the older children became kind of mentors for the younger children. we worked on fashioning these kind of costumes of like birch bark, which we cut from trees in the forest, dead trees in the forest. And birch bark is a kind of very traditional craft material in Russia. People used to make everything from baskets to birch bark canoes and so on and so on. So we made these kind of costumes that the kids would wear, the young, kind of like, usually anywhere between 8 and 12, I think the kids were. And then the idea was to have this kind of procession across this Khrushchev era landscape. The boys in the woodworking school with the timber frame would move it through the landscape, over hills and down and through boulevards, Soviet boulevards. And then there would be this moment of encounter where they'd go to the other school where the kids in costume were, and they'd all just kind of blend together. They'd have this moment of like seeing each other for the first time, and then all in one unit, kind of continuing on the journey. I think it's quite a 4-kilometer walk in total through Kupchina. This is quite a spectacle in Russia. Public space in Russia is like very particular. Obviously, under communism, any public gatherings had to be kind of for the Communist Party, and quite orchestrated, and a lot of red tape there. And indeed, today there's still a lot of red tape around kind of getting this sort of thing legitimized by the council, and of course we had to get it legitimized. And that's just kind of the procession moving through. So there's a clip of this online, just the last, again, it filmed in Super 8, the film, and just the kids, and these are film posters then, and this is the kind of final event with the house built and this kind of accordion player, and the daughter of Vasilieva as this kind of, it's really quite, I don't know how to explain it yet. I don't speak Russian, honestly. I'm just behind the camera, and the energy was good and the feeling was good. Like, it was very good, and she became very alive and started singing and dancing. It was like she was the spirit took her, you know, and I think she was quite touched by the whole thing. So then this is kind of like this kind of speculative custom. I went back to Russia. That's when I met Eyal during the Public Arts Symposium in St. Petersburg last year. It was screened in both schools. The film was screened in both schools. I suppose the legacy of this is like, well, maybe this could be done again. Like with the butter making festival. Maybe it doesn't have to be a folk fiction next time. Maybe people can take it in hands, the municipality can get on board and actually make this a legitimate tradition for Kupchina. I don't know. That's what I'm kind of interested in. It'd be a brilliant outcome for the work if people did it for themselves, for real. It'd be extraordinary. But I suppose that's kind of out of my hands, you know. I'm just gonna. How are we doing? Are we all right? I'm kind of good to talk.
I think maybe you should show a piece of the movie because it makes everything, like the whole Super 8.
I don't have it here on the computer.
But the online,
Do we have it?
Yeah, good idea.
What is it?
Good idea. Vimeo. It'll take me ages to find this, but I'll look, will I? Vimeo.com.
It's on
our.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
The event.
Facebook show.
No. Tienes mucha.
This is a good idea. I should have pre-organized this.
But it's a very nice movie.
It's
Tienes la event special.
Yeah.
yeah, so. Hopefully it worked. this work I'll show back in Ireland for the first time in a kind of art space context. So I'll need to come up with a display solution and a recut of the film to make it kind of, I suppose, work within, work beyond location, work beyond site. It's something I've done, it's something I hope to do in Russia, but I couldn't get any leads. I've done it in Ireland, where you try and find local Super 8 films from the people from that location that date back over this time that the medium was active, and you get those films digitized for the location, and then that also becomes kind of part of a kind of movie night for the community of interest or the community. And I'm sure in some of these flats there's loads of Super 8, because Super 8 was really big in the Soviet Union. Yeah, and it's quite nice. What she has in her hand, this isn't captured in the film. This is a rocket that her mother had 37 years ago. That when she said, when the authorities come, I'm going to fire the rocket. You know, just as a kind of last act, you know. When the authorities come, the authorities were too quick for her. She couldn't, I don't know. She didn't get to fire the rocket, but she kept the rocket ever since then, and I can capture it on camera, which I think is good. But Irieta, her brother fired the rocket on that day after then keeping it in a bag for like 37 years. So that was like, okay, the work means something to the work. Yeah, it did something, you know. Of course, I don't speak Russian, and I'm just behind the camera, and I don't know what's going on. That's Joanna Rakowska. She's great, Polish artist. So I mean, when I screen the film to the community of interest, it's important you have a lot of people in, so people get to see themselves. And then when I need to make a cut for an art context, I need to become a little bit more, you know, less puppy dogs and babies, you know, kind of less just. And then she disappears into the wood. The house used to be located in some of those woods. Of course, they bulldozed the house and they didn't build anything there. So that photo I showed you. These are some of those trees 37 years later or whatnot, you know. Okay, so I just have one more kind of thing. This is the work I'm going to present to you in fragments. This is a project I've been invited to do. It's manifesting in July this year. Well, it's production in July this year and then realization in September for a place called in the Sud Tyrol, or Alto Adige, depending if you speak German or you speak Italian. The Südtirol, I don't know if you know it, it's the most northern part of Italy. It's this province that Italy joined World War I on the side of the Allies as a prize for Italy, thank you very much for taking on the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the southern front. The Südtirol, which was probably 82% German speaking, was ceded to Italy. It became part of Italy in 1919. So with that it was renamed Alto Adige, and what was part of like the German-speaking world predominantly, with a kind of profoundly Germanic Alpine culture. This is in the Alps, not exclusively so, but it suddenly found itself part of answering to Rome rather than to Vienna. What was I going to say on that front? Just on the kind of Südtirol, if we look at kind of landscape and climate and bioregion and latitude and all this, this is the kind of part of Europe where, as I say, people who eat white focaccia bread or paninis meet people who eat pumpernickel, rye bread, black breads, where people who like to have a glass of wine with said bread meet people who drink beer. A place where people who put olive oil on their bread meet those who put butter on their bread. So it's just like really, and it's also a highway. There's the Brenner Pass at the top of it. You go up the valley and you get to the top, the Brenner Pass, and then you go down the other side into Austria. So it's historically a highway between two big European cultures, the Latin, Italian, and the Germanic speaking world. This is this is a very key and significant mountain. It's only the kind of Italian rationale for having the Südtirol was tied up with the Irredentist movement, which was a nationalist movement. Obviously, Italy was unified under Garibaldi in the 1870s. A lot of those wars were against the Austrians in the north. A peace treaty was signed. Trent and the Südtirol remained Austro-Hungarian. But since then, as a function of Italian kind of nationalism, it's like we need to get this. Italy must be whole. Italy must be one. So the rationale for why the Südtirol was Italian wasn't anything got to do with like the 82% of German speakers. It was got to do with the geography. So up here, and this is in the Arntal Valley, the river runs down the Arn runs down this valley and goes all the way down and eventually hits the Po and it comes out right near Venice. If you cross that Brenner Pass, if you go over to the other side, the river flows down, it goes through Innsbruck, and then it hits the Danube and it comes out in the Black Sea. So to the Italian kind of nationalistic geographer's mind, this is Italy, this is naturally, this is normally, it's supposed to be Italy. So this is the kind of argument they brought to the Treaty of Versailles. They had also been very adept in presenting Woodrow Wilson with maps of the region with Italian names, including this mountain here, which is the German name is the Glockenkarkopf, and that goes back centuries, and the Italian name, which dates from 1905, is called the Vetta d'Italia, the peak of Italy, the top bit. And that was renamed by this man called Ettore Ptolemy, who's a kind of the so-called undertaker to the German-speaking population, the so-called undertaker of the Südtirol. Ptolemy was a fascist, nationalist. He later became the kind of governor, the senator of the Südtirol. He really came to power with Mussolini. When Mussolini take over of Italy, and the fascists take over, Ptolemy was then he really got to express his ideas for the Südtirol officially, and with the power of the black shirts behind him. 1922, these are kind of, you can't see them here, they're small, but they're basically like Ptolemy's 32 points for the Italianization of Alto Adige, and that included like no more calling it the Sud Tyrol. All law and all economics, all laws to be, courts are to be conducted through Italian, Italianization of German surnames, Italianization of road and pathways, the dismissal of German officials or transfer to old provinces, introduction as Italian as the official school of law and in schools, no German in schools, so on. Kind of just classic, just very classic. This is like the penal laws that we had in Ireland in the 1700s, which we got from Britain. Just a way of kind of, yeah, just driving out one cultural expression in favour of another. This is an example, and this is a real bone of contention. Just regarding the Sud Tyrol today, in 1992, the Italian and the Viennese foreign ministers went to the European Parliament, and they said the Sud Tyrolean issue is closed. It's resolved. Everyone can live happily ever after. We're okay. You know, the Viennese or the Austrians are okay. Italians are okay, and that's basically because the region. It looked like it was going to get violent, like Northern Ireland. There was underground German movements blowing up stuff, trying to undermine the economy in the 60s. That couldn't obviously happen at the heart of the European project. There's no way they could have this device forward. It would undermine the entire premise behind the European economic community. So a lot of kind of money was drawn at the issue, and a lot of attention was drawn at the issue. Out of that, like Sud Tyrol got a large degree of autonomy regarding its own taxation and its own laws, and a kind of proportional representational system was created, whereby government would reflect the proportion of Italian speakers or German speakers, or also the Ladin, which is not to be confused with Ladino. Ladin, which is a kind of a Latin mountain language from, you know, a kind of Latin dialect which still lives in certain valleys. So it looked like violence, it looked like trouble. In the 60s it was settled. So much so in 1992 people say it's resolved. This is still a massive issue in the Sud Tyrol. The Italian names still stand. The Italian names that Ptolemy and his agency, 10,000 names of villages, mountains, rivers, etc., which in a few short years were Italianized. Those are still the official names on official maps. This is an image from the 60s of like the Italian stroked out, and this is kind of classic language wars. I might just show another film. Now, so we're looking at the meeting of historically two great European cultures, matched with, if we fast forward to the 1930s, it gets much more complex and interesting indeed. We've got Mussolini fascist, we've got Hitler, the Anschluss with Austria in 1936, National Socialist ideology is the reunification of German peoples and beyond, actually, you know, so we'll take back Alsace, we'll take back the Sudetenland. I mean, I don't need to go on here, you know, then we'll get labels around, then we'll spread out. Hitler needed Mussolini, Mussolini needed Hitler. Nazi ideology was based around blood und Boden, blood and soil. But to keep the relationship between these two fascist powers sweet, like Hitler expressed no interest in the Sud Tyrol. So the people of the South Tyrol were given an option, what was called the option, in 1939. And that was blood oder Boden, blood or soil. If you chose blood, and you're German speaking, that meant you had to leave the South Tyrol behind, you had to leave and be relocated. And the three places the Reich had identified, resettled, as places for resettlement were, pertinently enough, the Crimea, The Tatra mountains, or these are mountain people, we put them in mountains in Poland and Moravia and Czech Republic, or Slovak, they'll settle in, or Burgundy in France, also mountains. So why Crimea, I don't know, that was an odd German, a Nazi fabrication that these people are originally Goths, they come from Crimea, it's just so I'm just going to, what happened then in 1939 was a culture commission was sent to the South Tyrol. And I might actually, I'll come back to that film. The so-called Anachronism, which might be familiar to you, was the Nazi culture commission, archaeologists, ethnographers, anthropologists, ethnomusicologists, and so on and so on. A culture commission was sent to the South Tyrol, led by this man called Richard Wolfram, who was the head of folk studies in German folk and cultural studies in Vienna. So he was made the head of this to kind of lead this commission. This is just a map of the Anachronism. The Anachronism, the most kind of, the easiest reference in popular culture is Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Indiana Jones and the one where they're looking for the Ark of the Covenant, the first film, and the guy that melts at the end of the film. I mean, this is very iconic. He was one of the Anachronism. Good enough for him. So they went all around Europe. They went to Tibet. They went to the Canary Islands. They went to conduct his prehistory, this archaeology of the Aryan race, like total, like really off the books kind of stuff, you know, really off the wagon. Now, the commission that was sent to South Tyrol was quite particular, because their job was like salvage ethnography. Salvage ethnography, this documentation of a culture just before it ceases to exist or changes beyond all recognition. So their job was to gather all the kind of folk, because folk was really folk culture, the Volkskunde, of this Germanic-speaking people, so that when they were relocated to the Crimea or Burgundy or the Tatars, did have their culture, and they could just begin again. It's probably a good time to show you this film now. I'll just show you. This film I was in the Vienna Mediathek, the archives, the Stadtarchive, and this is a film. Now, just to kind of contextualize this film, we have to remember all German culture was banned for the last 18 years. No German culture, or very little, So what we have in the Alps is a very intensely alpine people with a very strong, at times it's intensely Catholic culture, but as with all Catholicism kind of assimilated kind of local kind of traditions and made them, Christianized them, baptized them, so to speak. So this film, when the Anachronism went back to document the culture, they had to kind of like say, oh, will you re-perform your culture that you've been banned doing, like for a generation, but will you do it one more time for our cameras so that you'll have your culture when we relocate you? So one more time, but for the Anachronism camera, folk fiction of sorts. Now, and this is a film shot by Wolfram. The original films were lost probably in Berlin with the bombing of Berlin. The original films that had voiceover and everything. This is just Wolfram with a 16mm, just taking snips on his just a few shots. And this is in a village called Trami, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Some of the people that had already been settled, some of the people who were repositories of this culture had already moved to other parts of the Reich. They had to be brought back. Costumes had to be made. Costumes had to be pulled out of old barns. These are Schnappwicker. This is a whole festival after the winter. And it's to drive out winter. Winter's gone.
How did they conquer Europe?
So winter's gone, right? And this is before. It's slow to load. This is the only time of the year these people can make a parade like this, because the rest of the time of the year it's too fucking cold, or they're working like bejesus to get enough food. These are people that like just drive out winter. They run. I met a Subterranean, and he's like shoveling snow off a mountain to get the grass to grow, so you can get the animals out. You know, so it's like really 7 months of your year is winter. If you haven't done enough work, if you haven't stored enough food, if you haven't cured the pig right, the bacon, the speck, you're not going to make it. You know, so this is like this moment of frivolity. Spring is back, and we're out, and we've got all these traditions, and it's basically a time for, like, these are the bakers. There's different kind of guilds, and they get to kind of perform themselves. This is an old lady, right? And you put her in this mill. It's a happy ending, right? And she just want to go. Okay. Watch closely.